Sustainability, Part 1. We're going to examine this definition that was come up by the Brundtland Commission in 1987. So before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about what came before the Brundtland Commission. Coming out of the Second World War ended in 1945. We saw a period of extreme international growth. Growth economically, growth in terms of technology and population, in improved economic status for the, I would say, a large portion of the population. So lots of stuff happened coming out of the Second World War. We saw the production of this wonder material, plastics. Prior to the Second World War, plastics were not really a thing. Plastics are created by petrochemicals, and they really solved a huge problem. They solved the problem of limited resources. So up until the era of plastics, products were made from natural materials primarily. So things like wood or steel or cotton or silk or any number of naturally occurring resources and products. As the population of the planet grew, as the needs of this growing population grew, people realized that they were running out of these, let's call them primary products. And plastics came along just in time to offer a solution. If you look at the styles and fashions of the 1950s, you see this. There was a real emphasis on clean lines and monochromatic colors and plastic-derived products. Things started to change in the 1960s. We had begun to rely on industrialized agriculture by the 1960s. We were starting to rely on pesticides and herbicides and artificial fertilizers. Up until that time, primarily, the people had relied on natural versions of these things. So things that naturally, or I should say practices that naturally discouraged insect pests, or practices that naturally helped to keep weeds at bay. Now we were going into an era of these massive monoculture agriculture projects, and a widespread use of pesticides and herbicides and chemical fertilizers, largely based on petroleum products, that helped to increase production. Towards the end of the 60s, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring about the widespread use of DDT. DDT was used, among other things, to cut back on pests, to reduce mosquito populations and other pests. And it was heralded as largely innocuous, yet it had an enormous impact on ecosystems. And DDT is mostly outlawed among first world countries now, although it's still used in some countries that rely upon DDT to keep down things like mosquito populations, to control malaria. But in Canada, we don't use DDT at all anymore, of course. And this is interesting because this was kind of a real backlash, a pushback on the utopian idealism of the 1950s. So the Brundtland Commission came out of this recognition that, all was not quite as good as it seemed. So the Brundtland Report acknowledged a future threatened by environmental, social, and economic problems. The report warned that these problems tend to get worse over time. The proposed solution was sustainable development, with the objective of balancing economy, society, and the environment, and proposing that the needs of the present can be met without compromising the capacity of future generations. And you see this in this definition here. The Commission stated that sustainable development requires the satisfaction of the basic needs of all, since poverty can lead to ecological and other catastrophes. By creating a definition, however, that was palatable to everyone, sustainable development has served to perpetuate the system in which it was created. So one of the problems with this definition is its lack of definitions. So what do we mean by needs? What do we mean by without compromising the ability of future generations? And how do we measure that? How do we know what will and will not compromise future generations? And how do we know what compromises future generations? So this is a really vague definition. It doesn't really serve us in the long term, even though it appears to. It's very broad. It's very easy to manipulate and to use for your own needs. So it did allow for things like greenwashing, and it does not reflect a recognition of planetary boundaries. The main criticism, however, is related to the economic perspective that demands continuous growth on a finite planet, as well as the goal of development itself. What do we mean by that in an industrialized society such as ours? Which international public policy has imposed on people around the world for many, many years? So sustainable development is inspired by the belief that economic growth and technological development will solve social and environmental problems. And indeed, sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we have these unintended consequences. In this sense, the proposal of the Brundtland Report of a new era of economic growth was deeply flawed. Human society around the world established goals and focused on attaining these economic aspirations, but the lack of improvement in the socio-ecosystemic problems of the last 4 decades highlights the impossibility of endless economic growth. So we've largely been born into an economic paradigm, a cultural paradigm that suggests that we maintain this economic growth. The globalized society of the 20th century established its goals within this economic framework rather than in terms of maintaining the integrity of the biosphere or coupling to the natural cycles of the ecosystems. At present, human activity is strongly influenced by the logic of markets and economic growth, which is the discourse that's embedded within our societies. This logic is rarely questioned in business or political spheres. It is simply assumed, and goals are established to obtain objectives that are mainly related to economic growth. And we certainly see this when we try to implement these kinds of models. And I'll start with the three-legged sustainability stool model, which is very close to the 3 pillars of sustainability that you're probably all familiar with. So in this model, and I think there's a certain elegance to this model, so I like to use it as an example of how good intentions can go wrong. We have the economic, environmental, and social legs that hold equal importance. So the idea is that if one of these legs is not as valued as the others, the stool will tip over. Well, we know that the economic leg is invariably prioritized. The social leg comes in usually second, and if the environmental leg is considered at all, it's a distant third. So this stool is already unhealthy. This stool is toppled on the ground. And so this particular model does not reflect our reality. So goals centered on a vision of economic growth are not coherent with the natural processes of the biosphere. And so they are in direct conflict with thermodynamic and complex systems principles. By prioritizing the economy, we prioritize consumption. Because think about it for a moment. You cannot have increased economic growth without increased consumption. Consumption drives our economy. So a society that depends on perpetual economic growth promotes a business model that actually seeks to reduce the lifespan of products and creates unnecessary products to generate more demand and more production. So if our goal is equality, we must reduce and limit excess consumption. Right now, our economic system privileges certain sectors with high levels of consumption, which in turn creates a desire for high consumption lifestyles. The gap between the advantaged and the disadvantaged increases with time, and social problems are intensified. I mean, think about it. If people who are underprivileged see people with way more than they need, what does that promote? It promotes discontent. It promotes a weakening of our social systems. So conceiving of an economy or a society outside the environmental framework does not recognize that society depends on the biosphere, and the economy is a social subsystem and is incoherent with the laws of physics.